I want to talk about what happens after you build something that matters. Not the victory lap, not the legacy interviews. I mean the specific errors in thinking that occur once the central effort of your working life is behind you. Most people believe the danger after a career is idleness. They think the problem is not having enough to do. They imagine that someone who spent decades building companies will struggle with empty hours, with the absence of meetings and decisions and forward motion. The assumption is that the risk is boredom or irrelevance, or the slow fade into comfortable obscurity. This sounds reasonable. It fits the way we talk about retirement and aging and the end of professional identity. But it is not accurate. The real mistakes that happen after a career are not about having too little to occupy your time. They are about misunderstanding what your previous work actually was, and therefore misapplying the capacities you developed during it. The errors are cognitive, not emotional. They stem from a failure to recognize that the skills and instincts that made you effective in one context do not transfer cleanly to another. And because you do not see this, you repeat patterns that no longer produce the results you expect. I am not talking about people who retire to play golf or travel. I am talking about people like me who cannot stop working, who build and advise and invest and speak, who remain in motion long after the central project is complete. The mistakes I am describing happen to people who stay engaged. They happen because engagement alone is not enough. You must also understand what you are engaging with and why, and whether the framework you are using still applies. Here is the first mistake. You assume that pattern recognition, which served you for decades, will continue to serve you in the same way. You believe that because you have seen certain sequences before, you can predict them again. You trust your instincts because your instincts were frequently correct. And in many cases, they still are. But the context has changed, and you do not notice the change because the surface details look familiar. When I returned to Apple in 1997, I could see immediately what was broken. The product line was incoherent. The company had no focus. The culture had lost its intensity. I had seen these problems before in different forms, and I knew how to address them. I cut the product line from dozens of models to 4. I rebuilt the executive team. I re-established a standard of excellence that had eroded. The pattern I applied was one I had learned over years of building and refining organizations. It worked because the context supported it. The company needed clarity, and I provided clarity. But after you leave that context, the same pattern does not always apply. You see a young company struggling with focus, and you assume the solution is the same. You advise them to cut products, to simplify, to concentrate resources. Sometimes this is correct. Often it is not. The company may need to explore, to test multiple directions, to discover what works before committing. Your instinct, honed in a different environment, leads you to prescribe the wrong solution. You do not realize this because the problem looks the same. But the stage of development is different, and the intervention that works at one stage can damage another. This is not about being out of touch. It is about the limits of pattern recognition. Patterns are useful when the underlying structure is stable. When the structure changes, the pattern becomes a liability. You do not see the change because you are looking at the surface, and the surface resembles something you have encountered before. Your confidence in your judgment, which is based on decades of being right, prevents you from questioning whether the situation is actually analogous. The second mistake is believing that your value lies in your opinions. You spent years making decisions that shaped products, companies, industries. People listened to you because your judgment was sound and your vision was clear. You became accustomed to your perspective being sought and to it being acted upon. After your career, people still seek your perspective. They want to know what you think about their product, their strategy, their market, and you give them your opinion because that is what they asked for. and because you have opinions, and because offering them feels like contributing. But here is what you do not see. The value you provided during your career was not primarily your opinions. It was your commitment. It was the fact that you would live with the consequences of your decisions. You would spend years executing on a direction you chose. You would refine it, adjust it, defend it, and ultimately be judged by whether it succeeded. Your opinions were valuable because they were attached to responsibility. They were not abstract judgments. They were commitments you were willing to stake your time and reputation on. After your career, your opinions are no longer attached to commitment. You can say what you think, but you will not be there to execute it. You will not spend the next 5 years living with whether you were right. This changes the nature of what you are offering, but you do not adjust for it. You continue to speak with the same certainty, the same authority, because you do not recognize that the weight behind your words has changed. You are no longer offering a direction you will execute. You are offering a perspective you will not be accountable for. The people who ask for your opinion do not always understand this either. They hear your certainty and they assume it carries the same weight it once did. They may follow your advice and it may be wrong and you will not be there to correct it. Or they may ignore your advice and it may have been right, but because you were not committed to seeing it through, it was only half-formed. The mistake is not that you have opinions. The mistake is thinking that opinions, detached from commitment, are the same thing you were providing before. Pew. Mistake number 3. Mistaking conviction for clarity. The third mistake is harder to see. You believe you have become clearer with age, more direct, less tolerant of ambiguity or corporate hedging. You have spent decades navigating complexity, and now you can cut through noise that confuses younger operators. This feels like wisdom. But here is what actually happens. You have become less capable of holding contradictions. When you were building something, you lived inside paradox every day. You needed the product to be both simple and powerful. You needed the team to be both autonomous and aligned. You needed to move fast and get it right. These were not slogans, they were operational realities you balanced hour by hour, decision by decision. You did not resolve these tensions, you managed them. The management of contradiction requires immersion. It requires feeling the specific weight of competing priorities in a particular context. You knew when to let the engineers run and when to overrule them, not because you had a principle, but because you had presence. You were there. After your career, you are no longer there. And without that daily immersion, the contradictions you once managed collapse into convictions. The nuanced becomes binary. The situational becomes absolute. I see this in myself. Someone describes a product strategy that involves multiple customer segments. I say, no, pick one, go deep, serve them completely. This sounds like focus. It sounds like the discipline that saved Apple. But what if this particular company, in this particular market, genuinely needs to serve multiple segments to achieve distribution? What if the contradiction between breadth and depth is not a failure of strategy, but the actual problem they must solve? I am no longer positioned to know, yet my conviction has not diminished. If anything, it has intensified. The certainty that came from managing contradictions daily has been replaced by certainty that comes from no longer seeing them. This is not about being wrong. You will sometimes be right. The advice to focus, to simplify, to choose. This is often correct. The mistake is not recognizing that your clarity is a reduction, that you have traded the ability to hold complexity for the comfort of conviction. You can see this pattern in how former operators talk about their own past decisions. The stories become cleaner, the choices become more obvious. The turning points gain clarity they did not have at the time. When I describe cutting Apple's product line in 1997, I make it sound inevitable. Dozens of products reduced to 4. The decision that saved the company. But I do not talk about the weeks of argument, the engineers who believed their projects were essential, the international markets where product proliferation had logic, the fear that simplification might be amputation. The decision was correct, but it was not clear. It was a managed contradiction. We needed focus, but we also needed enough offerings to maintain retail relationships and manufacturing scale. I lived inside that tension until the specifics of Apple's situation, our cash position, our brand erosion, our operational chaos made the direction unmistakable. Now, 20 years later, I remember the clarity of the outcome. I do not remember the confusion of the process. And when I advise a company to focus, I bring the conviction of the outcome without the uncertainty of the method. I give them my clarity, which is real, but I cannot give them the immersion that made the clarity actionable. This creates a specific failure mode. The company takes your advice, they simplify, they focus, and it does not work, because the contradiction they needed to manage was not the same contradiction you resolved. Their market is not your market. Their team is not your team. Their moment is not your moment. But you do not see this. You see a failure of execution. They did not commit fully. They hedged. They let complexity creep back in. You become more convinced that focus was right. They become more confused about why it failed. The conviction that should have been tempered by distance instead gets reinforced by misdiagnosis. I watch this happen with people who advise on company culture. They remember building strong cultures, demanding, coherent, high-performing. They remember the intensity, the standards, the intolerance for mediocrity. What they do not remember is the 1,000 micro-adjustments, the times they relaxed a principle because a specific person needed space. The contradictions between hire slow, fire fast, and give people room to grow. The difference between standards that elevate and standards that calcify. They remember the conviction. They do not remember the calibration. So they advise young companies to set a high bar and maintain standards with an absoluteness that their own practice never had. They have mistaken the outcome of managed complexity for the simplicity of a rule. The younger operators who are still living inside the contradictions hear this advice and face a choice. Ignore the wisdom of experience or apply principles that do not bend to their context. Some ignore it. They nod politely and continue managing their specific tensions. Others follow it. They implement the conviction without the calibration. They set standards without the 1,000 adjustments that make standards humane. They focus without understanding what their particular focus should preserve. Both outcomes represent a loss. The first loses the genuine pattern knowledge you carry. The second loses the contextual intelligence they were developing. And you, standing outside the daily operation, cannot tell which is happening. Your conviction prevents you from seeing that your clarity might be the problem. This mistake compounds over time. Each instance where your advice seems vindicated, where focus worked, where high standards elevated performance reinforces the conviction. You do not see the cases where the same advice failed because those companies stop asking. They drift away. They find other advisors. You are left with a selected sample, the situations where your convictions happen to match the context. This makes you more certain, not less. I have tried to counter this in myself. When I advise now, I try to include the uncertainty. I try to say, this worked for us, but here were the 10 reasons it almost did not work. Here were the contradictions we never resolved. But even this is a reduction. I am describing remembered uncertainty, not felt uncertainty. I am packaging the chaos into a story about chaos. The real uncertainty was not knowing if we would survive the next quarter. It was not a teaching point. It was a condition. You cannot transmit that condition through advice. You can only acknowledge its absence. The recognition of this mistake does not eliminate it. I still feel the conviction. I still experience my clarity as insight rather than reduction. But I can sometimes catch myself. When I hear my own certainty, I can ask, am I clear because I understand this situation, or am I clear because I am no longer inside any situation? The answer is uncomfortable. Most of the time, my clarity comes from distance, from the collapse of contradictions I no longer have to manage, from the conversion of lived complexity into remembered principle. This does not make the principles wrong, but it makes them insufficient. The person who needs to hold the contradiction is not me. It is the operator who is still there, still immersed, still feeling the specific weight of competing priorities. My job is not to give them clarity. My job is to remind them that the clarity will come from their immersion, not from my conviction. But that is not what conviction wants to do. Conviction wants to be certain, wants to be clear, wants to resolve. And so the mistake continues. You mistake your conviction for clarity. You offer certainty in place of complexity. You give answers when you should be protecting questions. And the people who listen, who trust your experience, who believe your clarity is wisdom, they inherit your convictions without the context that made them valid. This is the third mistake. It is not about being wrong. It is about being clear in a way that obscures more than it reveals. Mistake. 4. You believe your judgment has improved. The fourth mistake is the most insidious because it feels like wisdom. You believe your judgment has gotten better with time. You have perspective now, distance. You can see patterns that eluded you during the chaos of building. The fog has lifted. This is not entirely wrong, but it is not right in the way you think it is. Here is what actually happens. Your judgment has not improved. It has calcified. When you were operating, judgment was a living thing. It changed daily. You made a decision on Monday, gathered data on Tuesday, questioned the decision on Wednesday, doubled down on Thursday, and reversed course on Friday. Not because you were confused, but because the situation kept revealing itself. Judgment was iterative, responsive, alive. Now, after the career, your judgment feels more refined because it no longer changes. You reach conclusions faster. You see the answer more clearly. You do not waffle or second-guess. You mistake this rigidity for maturity. I notice this in myself when young founders present their strategies. I listen for perhaps 3 minutes before I know what they should do. The answer arrives fully formed. It feels like insight, like the product of decades synthesizing into clarity. But here is what I do not feel: doubt. Not uncertainty about whether I am right. I can still access that intellectually. I mean the doubt that lives in your body when you are responsible for the outcome. The doubt that wakes you at 3 a.m. The doubt that makes you call one more person, run one more scenario, sit with the decision for one more day. That doubt was not weakness. It was judgment still forming. Without it, judgment becomes verdict. The mechanism of calcification. Let me be specific about how this happens. When you are building something, judgment operates in a feedback loop. You decide, you act, you observe consequences, you adjust your decision-making framework. The loop runs continuously, thousands of cycles, each one calibrating your sense of what works. But the loop requires action and consequence. After the career ends, the loop breaks. You still decide in fact, you decide constantly, offering opinions to founders, investors, boards, but you do not act on those decisions. Someone else does. And you do not observe the consequences, not really. You might hear a report months later, filtered through the founder's narrative. You might see a headline. You might never hear anything at all. The feedback loop becomes a feedback trickle. So your judgment stops calibrating. It freezes at the last point of calibration, which was the final phase of your operating career. All the pattern matching, all the heuristics, all the instincts, they are locked to that moment. You do not notice this because you keep having opinions, and some of those opinions turn out to be correct. When a founder follows your advice and succeeds, it confirms the judgment. When they fail, well, they probably did not execute it properly, or the market shifted, or they were not ready to hear it. The mechanism that once kept your judgment, honest, direct exposure to being wrong, has been removed. What remains feels like wisdom, but functions like doctrine. The seduction of consistency. There is something else that makes this mistake particularly hard to see. Your judgment becomes more consistent. When you were operating, you contradicted yourself regularly. You said one thing in January and the opposite in March. Not because you were incoherent, but because January's situation was not March's situation. The contradictions were features, not bugs. They reflected reality's complexity. After the career, the contradictions smooth out. You develop a philosophy, a framework, a set of principles that apply broadly. This feels like progress. Finally, you have distilled the lessons. You are no longer reactive, lurching from decision to decision. You have a coherent worldview. And this worldview is useful. I am not suggesting it is worthless. A framework built from decades of experience contains real insight. But here is the trap. You begin to trust the framework more than the situation. A founder describes their challenge. Before they finish, you are mapping it onto your framework. You recognize the pattern. You know which principle applies. You deliver the answer with confidence. You do not spend much time in the uncertainty of their specific context because you have already classified it. The framework has done its work. This is efficient. It allows you to advise many companies, to move quickly through problems, to offer decisive guidance. It is also a form of blindness. Because the situations that mattered most in your career, the ones that defined the outcome, were precisely the ones that did not fit the existing frameworks. They were the anomalies, the contradictions, the moments when the pattern broke. And you only saw them because you were immersed, because you were living in the daily texture of the problem, not classifying it from above. What you lose. Let me tell you what I have lost, specifically. I used to be able to hold two opposing ideas in my mind and work productively with both. Not as a thought exercise, but as operational reality. At Apple, we needed products that were both simple and powerful. These are in tension. Simplicity usually means removing power. Power usually means adding complexity. The work was navigating that tension, finding the rare solutions that gave you both. I lived inside that paradox, daily. It was uncomfortable, but the discomfort was the work. Now, when I advise companies on product strategy, I find myself resolving the paradox too quickly. I lean towards simplicity, cut features, focus, make it clearer. This is not wrong. It is often right. But I am no longer inside the tension. I am no longer feeling the specific ways this product, for this market, at this moment, might need to be powerful first and simple later. Or simple in interface but powerful in capability. Or apparently complex but actually simple once you understand it. I have a position. Simplicity wins. This position is built from experience. It is defensible, it is often correct, but it is not judgment. It is the residue of judgment. Real judgment would require me to enter the uncertainty of their situation, to feel the tension they are feeling, to live with the problem long enough that the answer emerges from the specifics, not from my principles. I cannot do this anymore. Not because I lack the intellectual capacity, but because I lack the necessity. I am not staying up at night worrying about their product. I am not spending next year living with the consequences. So I substitute my framework for their immersion. And I call this wisdom. The illusion of elevation. There is a particular feeling that accompanies this mistake, and it is worth naming because the feeling is part of what sustains the error. You feel elevated, not in status, though that may come too, but in perspective. You can see the forest now, not just the trees. You have risen above the tactical chaos. You understand the deeper patterns. This elevation feels like the reward for decades of work. You have climbed high enough to see what you could not see before. And there is truth in this. Distance does provide perspective. You can see patterns across companies, across industries, across decades. This is valuable. But elevation has a cost that is easy to miss. You can no longer see the ground. The texture disappears. The details that do not fit the pattern become invisible. The specific context that makes this situation different from the last one, you are too high up to see it. When you were operating, you were on the ground. You could see the forest and the trees because you moved between them. You zoomed in and out constantly. Tactical on Monday, strategic on Tuesday, back to tactical on Wednesday. Now you stay elevated. You are advising multiple companies, sitting on boards, speaking at conferences. You cannot afford to zoom in. There is not enough time, and it is not your role. So you operate from altitude. You see the big picture. You identify the pattern. You give the strategic advice, and you do not see what you are missing. The founder nods, takes notes, thanks you for your wisdom. They go back to the ground level, where the details you did not see determine whether your advice works or fails. Sometimes it works. When it does, your elevated perspective gets the credit. Sometimes it fails. When it does, the execution gets the blame. The feedback loop that might correct your judgment never completes. You remain elevated, confident that your perspective is clearer than theirs. You do not consider that clarity and accuracy are not the same thing. That seeing less can feel like seeing more clearly. That the most important details might be the ones invisible from your altitude. The question. You stop asking. Here is how I know this is happening to me. There is a question I used to ask constantly when I was running Apple. What am I not seeing? Not as a rhetorical device, as a genuine inquiry, because I knew I could feel that my position, my assumptions, my patterns were obscuring something. The question was an attempt to find the blind spot. I asked it of other people. I asked it of myself. I structured meetings to surface it. I paid attention to the moments when something felt slightly off, slightly wrong, because that feeling often meant I was missing something important. The question was uncomfortable. It undermined certainty. It opened up doubt right when you wanted to be decisive. But it kept judgment alive. I do not ask that question anymore. Not really. I ask versions of it. What are we missing? What's the risk? What could go wrong? But these are analytical questions. They are asking for known unknowns, for risks we can identify and mitigate. What am I not seeing is different. It is asking about the unknown unknowns, the things my framework is hiding from me, the ways my experience might be a liability. I do not ask it because I do not feel the need. My judgment feels sound. My pattern recognition feels accurate. My advice feels helpful. The doubt that used to drive the question has been replaced by confidence. And confidence, unearned and unchecked, is where judgment goes to die. The fifth mistake, I have delayed naming it. Not because I do not know what it is. I know it precisely. I have watched myself commit it repeatedly over the past several years, with full awareness, unable or unwilling to stop. The fifth mistake is this. You continue building your identity around work that has already ended. This is different from the other mistakes. Those were cognitive errors, misapplied pattern recognition, judgment without feedback loops, conviction replacing complexity. They were failures of thinking. This is a failure of self-conception. the identity that will not update. When I returned to Apple in 1997, I was not the person who had founded it. I had been fired, built another company, acquired by the place that expelled me. I had changed, but I knew who I was in relation to the work. I was building. The identity was active, present, tense, continuous. After a career after the primary work concludes, the tense shifts. You were the person who built that company. You were the CEO who turned it around. You were the one who made those decisions. Past tense. But you do not update your identity to match. You continue to introduce yourself, in your mind, if not aloud, as the builder, the operator, the person who executes. You maintain the self-concept of someone actively creating, even as the creating has stopped or transformed into something fundamentally different. This would be harmless nostalgia if it were only internal. But it is not. It shapes every interaction. Every conversation with a founder seeking advice. Every board meeting. Every investment decision. You are performing a role that no longer matches your actual function, and the mismatch creates systematic distortions. Turkey. The advice you give to yourself. Here is how it manifests. A young founder comes to you with a problem. The problem is real, a co-founder conflict, a product direction decision, a hiring dilemma. You listen. You recognize patterns. You offer guidance. But underneath the explicit advice, you are giving yourself something else entirely. You are reassuring yourself that you are still the person you were, that your identity as a builder remains intact, that the skills still apply, the judgment still operates, the value still exists. The advice to them is also advice to yourself. You still matter in the way you used to matter. This is not conscious. I do not sit in meetings thinking, I will now use this founder's genuine problem to reassure myself about my fading relevance. The mechanism is subtler and more automatic, but it shapes which problems you choose to engage with, which questions you find interesting, which founders you spend time helping. You gravitate toward situations that allow you to perform the identity you wish to maintain. You avoid situations that would reveal the identity shift that would force you to acknowledge you are no longer primarily a builder but something else, an investor, an advisor, a former operator whose value now lies in pattern recognition rather than execution. The projects that serve the wrong purpose. This mistake compounds when you start new projects. People like me, people who cannot stop working, do not retire to silence. We start new things, investments, advisorships, sometimes new companies, though less frequently. The question is, why this project? There are legitimate reasons to start something new, a genuine problem you are positioned to solve, an opportunity that matches your actual capabilities, a contribution that serves a need beyond your own. But there is another reason, harder to admit. The project exists to preserve your identity. You start it not because it is the right thing to build, but because building is who you are, and stopping would require becoming someone different. I have watched myself do this. Evaluate opportunities not on their merit, but on whether they allow me to continue being Steve Jobs, the builder. Choose projects that let me perform the role I am familiar with rather than projects that match the person I have actually become. The projects are real. The work is genuine. But the motivation is corrupted by identity preservation. And because the motivation is wrong, the execution suffers. You are not fully committed to the project itself. You are committed to what the project does for your self-concept. When difficulties arise, when the work becomes tedious or unclear, you do not have the reserves of genuine purpose to sustain effort. You have only the need to maintain an identity which is not enough. The refusal to grieve. What makes this mistake so persistent is that correcting it requires grief. To update your identity, to acknowledge that you are no longer primarily the builder you were, means mourning the loss of that role. Not the work itself, but the centrality of it, the way it organized your sense of self. This is not the same as mourning retirement. People who retire to play golf or travel must also grieve the end of their working identity, but they have made a clear break. They have accepted the transition. This is harder. You are still working, still engaged, still contributing. But the nature of the contribution has changed, and admitting that feels like admitting decline. So you do not grieve. You do not acknowledge the loss. Instead, you maintain the old identity and try to find situations that confirm it still applies. This is why the other mistakes persist. Why you keep giving advice as if you were still operating. Why your judgment does not calibrate. Why you apply old patterns to new contexts without sufficient adaptation. You are trying to be someone you no longer are, and the trying prevents you from becoming whoever you might be next. What you lose by not updating. The cost is not only to the founders you advise or the projects you start. The cost is to yourself. By refusing to update your identity, you remain locked in a framework that no longer serves you. You cannot develop new capabilities because you are too busy maintaining old ones. You cannot discover what value you might offer from this new position because you are pretending the position has not changed. There are things you can see now that you could not see before. Patterns across companies, across industries, across decades. A perspective that comes only with distance and accumulated observation. Potentially wisdom, though I distrust that word. But you cannot access those capabilities while performing the role of active operator. The builder identity obscures the advisor identity, preventing you from becoming good at what you actually do now. And there is something else you lose, the ability to be interested in your own development. When your identity is fixed, when you have decided who you are and refuse to update it, you stop being curious about who you might become. You stop experimenting with new modes of contribution. You stop asking whether there might be forms of value you have not yet discovered. You become static. And static things, in my experience, do not remain valuable for long. The asymmetry of identity and function. Here is the mechanism underlying this mistake. Your function changes faster than your identity updates. When I was CEO of Apple, my function and identity were aligned. I built products, led teams, made decisions. My identity as a builder matched what I actually did each day. After that role ended, my function shifted immediately. I was no longer the CEO. I no longer had the authority, the team, the daily immersion in operational detail. But my identity did not shift at the same speed. It lagged. It still lags. Identity is stickier than function. It updates slowly, reluctantly, only under sustained pressure. And if you resist the pressure, if you find ways to perform the old identity in new contexts, it may not update at all. This creates a widening gap. Your function becomes advisory, but your identity remains operational. Your actual value lies in pattern recognition, but your self-concept centers on execution. You are compensated for perspective, but you think of yourself as someone who builds. The gap generates all the previous mistakes. You give advice as if you will execute it. Mistake number 2, because your identity is still executor. You apply old patterns without sufficient adaptation. Mistake number 1, because your identity is the person who solved that problem before. Your judgment calcifies. Mistake number 4, because updating it would require updating your identity, which you refuse to do. Can this be corrected? I do not know. I am describing a mistake I am currently making. I see it clearly. I understand the mechanism. I recognize the costs. And yet I continue. Perhaps awareness is the first step toward correction. Perhaps naming the pattern begins to loosen its grip, or perhaps this is simply what happens. Perhaps identity, once formed around significant work, cannot fully update. Perhaps the best you can do is see the gap, acknowledge it, try to compensate for it in your decisions and advice. I have tried compensation. When I advise founders now, I attempt to factor in this identity distortion. I ask myself, am I recommending this because it is right for them or because it allows me to perform being a builder? Am I engaging with this problem because I can genuinely help or because solving it reinforces who I think I am? Sometimes this self-interrogation helps. Sometimes I catch myself and adjust. But I do not trust that it is sufficient. The identity operates below the level of conscious questioning. By the time I am asking whether my motivation is corrupted, I have already chosen which problems to engage with, which meetings to take, which projects to start. The selection has already happened. What comes after identity? If you could update your identity, if you could release the self-concept built around work that has ended, what would replace it? I do not have an answer. I am still performing the old identity, still trying to be the builder, still resisting the update. But I suspect the answer is not another fixed identity. Not advisor or investor or elder statesman or any other stable role. Perhaps what comes after is something more fluid, an identity that can shift with function. A self-concept that updates as your actual contribution changes. This sounds appealing in theory. In practice, I do not know how to do it. I know how to be Steve Jobs, the person who builds products and companies. I have been that person for most of my life. The identity is deeply embedded, reinforced by decades of action and outcome. I do not know how to be Steve Jobs, the person whose identity updates fluidly with changing function. That would be a different kind of work. Not building companies, but building a self that can change. I have not started that work. I am not sure I can. But I can name the mistake. I can see it operating. I can acknowledge that the identity I maintain no longer matches what I actually do, and that the mismatch creates systematic errors in judgment and contribution. That is not correction. But it is honesty. And honesty, at minimum, prevents you from mistaking the performance of identity for the substance of value.